that their neighbor just passed away. The funeral took place yesterday. We know Elwood Morrison really quite well, but did not know that he had passed on. But we share our condolences, and we want to pray for, I think her name is Miriam? Marion, okay. And that we will take up later on as well. All right, we are continuing our studies in the prophecy, the biblical doctrine of prophecy, eschatology. And so I'm hoping that you are benefiting from this. Some of the things that I'm talking about you already know, and some of you are quite well versed in that. Not everybody is, and we got folks watching online that may not be getting regular feeding on the prophecy teaching, and so we want to be a benefit to the church as well as to those who are out and abroad. The first thing that I want to draw your attention to is the land of Israel during the days of Solomon. And the reason I picked the map in Solomon's day, because there was never a time in the history of Israel when they came so close to occupying all of the land that they will have in the Millennial Kingdom as they did under his reign. David didn't have as much, nor any king thereafter. And so if you can see on the map, you've got the lighter shade of coloring on this map, and that gives you a picture as to where Solomon's kingdom was. It was a significant area, although we know that none of that is really huge. So that was a time when Israel flourished like it has not flourished at any time in history. So that is Israel past. Now, one of the comments that I want to make, and that is so important in my mind, and I'm hoping it is in yours too, and that is that there is no other land mass, or water for that matter, but especially land mass, there is none that has the title deed given to that land by God, the Creator and the Maker of this world. Our country does not have that title. Our U.S. does not. There's no country anywhere in the world, none, that can lay claim to that. I guess maybe the Arabians might come close to making that claim, though God never specifically told them that this land is yours. He did tell the founders of the Arabian nations that they would also inherit a blessing. And so they really need to stop fighting over there, because that's how it all began way back in Ishmael's day and the Isaac's day. And so you've got this ongoing conflict that just doesn't come to an end. But in any case, they do not have a landmass that was designated theirs. So when someone says, I care not too much for Israel, believe me, there are more people than enough that say that. And there are unbelievably amount of church-going people, whether they're Christian or not, I wouldn't say, I don't know, but church-going people who are against Israel, and they would at this point be very critical of Israel for what is happening over there in that land at the moment as we speak. So this is where it didn't begin in Solomon's time, but it was never as fruitful as it was during Solomon's time. This is the land of Israel, somewhat, hopefully that's accurate. It is a picture of what Israel has today. As you notice that there is a significant reduction from the east side of the river that flows down to the Suez Canal. Under Solomon's time, and I'll just back up to show you the difference. Under Solomon's time, as you notice that there's a significant amount of land mass that was theirs during that time. They occupied it by God's giving it to them. What they have today is just a significant less amount. And so they're over just simply on the west side of the river that flows down. And Gaza, of course, is not there. So though Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel today, said he does not rule out occupying Gaza, because the Gaza is being used as a proxy location to do much harm to Israel. over 4,000 rockets have been fired into Israel, and the only reason that you don't have thousands of people dead is because of the Iron Dome. The Iron Dome is that device that shoots up at rockets and avoids rockets from hitting their targets. Very, very successful mechanism, and it's largely paid for by the United States of America. So at one point, somebody had his head on straight. So they have that, but he was saying that maybe Gaza might become occupied, and if they do occupy it, then of course the rockets flying to Israel will cease. Although the current president of the United States of America is telling them to negotiate a ceasefire, and that would mean that Israel again would have to give in to the Hamas and to the terrorist organizations. Not likely Benjamin Netanyahu will do that. In any case, we have in a large white pocket. Let me just move over there in case you're not sure where we are. Just over in this area, there's a very large piece cutting into the land of Israel. In the 1967 war, Israel occupied Jerusalem and all of this, and ever since then they've been giving land back to negotiate peace and to get the terrorists off their back. And so this is what they call the West Bank. I remember Jimmy DeYoung, a prophecy teacher, and that's his specialty and has been all of his life, said, and Jimmy DeYoung also lived in Jerusalem as a journalist. He said, don't call it the West Bank. He said, that's a misnomer. He said, that would be admitting that it belongs to other nations. He said, all of that land belongs to Israel, and I agree, it does. Biblically, that land belongs to Israel, but then again, the nations of the world do not recognize the Bible, and the nations of the world do not recognize God. So therefore, it becomes a complex matter. So that's where Israel is today. And I've got news for you. As we study the matter of prophecy, we will discover that Israel is only going to demise. It's only going to go downhill. And they're going to have nothing at the end. It's just coming to that. This world is not friendly towards Israel. The United Nations is death on Israel. The last places in the world where Israel can count on is the UK, Canada somewhat, and the US, that was a very strong ally and supporter, though now not so much. And that's very, very disheartening, but that's just the facts, and everything has so much to do with the governing authorities, who is in power at what time. And then, of course, Israel, this is the future land designation for Israel, and they will occupy from north to south and east to west all of the territory that God had promised to Abraham, something that Solomon was not able to do. But in the millennial kingdom, now it's interesting that Israel doesn't occupy the world in the millennial kingdom, but that's not the promise that God ever gave to them. God promised them this section of land, the section of land that you see here. And so you have from north, as far north as you can go is Dan, and then you go down as far as the south, down towards Egypt, touching the border of Egypt is Gad, and everything in between. And then you have this white strip that goes along in between there, and that is the Millennial Temple grounds. We're going to be doing a lesson or two, and I think that'll be long enough for us, on the temple that was never built. And we're going to be giving you a little bit of information about that. It's a complex matter. And if we're to study Ezekiel chapter 40 through 48, you would say, can we move on to something else, please? Because it's complex, it's difficult. And so it's in the scripture and it shows us, but it's important for us to realize that that too must come to pass. So I'm just showing you here tonight Israel past, Israel present, and Israel future. And that's what we're going to be focusing on tonight, next week, possibly the third week, on those matters. So in our study on the doctrines of prophecy, eschatology, Israelology, it's a word that actually is discoverable. Dr. Fruchtbaum has indeed majored on that word. He wrote a major treatise, a major book on on Israel as a doctrine in Scripture. Whether theologians will ever incorporate that into theological books is doubtful. But he maintains and argues that Israel should be a part of a theology. If wherever there's a systematic theology, there should be a section that is called Israelology. And I personally agree with him, but I'm just one of a few. But the doctrine of eschatology, so Israel is a biblical centerpiece. Now, it's amazing that you have a land that goes about 185 miles north to south, I think 60 or 70 miles east to west. I'm not sure about the dimension on that, but it's not very big. And it's interesting that the Bible focuses on a tiny little spot in the world as the apple of God's eye. We had some guests in last night, and they're up from the Waterloo region, up north of Waterloo. And I told him, I'm going to be teaching on Israel tonight. And he said, good. He said, that's the apple of God's eye. And I said, you're exactly right. And I'm not sure how he got that, because the churches he's going to don't say that. So at least he believes that because he reads his Bible. And so I just want us to look at the idea that Israel is a biblical centerpiece. So remember this, and I know that some people love to go to Israel. Maybe, just maybe, one day I'll go over there and see how my tree is doing. You say, what tree is that? I don't know. Somebody planted a tree and put Aaron Lois and my name by that tree as supporters, as sympathetic and prayers for the land of Israel. So I said, well, one day maybe that tree will flourish. We're praying that it will. If not now, then in the kingdom, I'll go check on it to make sure that it survived all of the Holocaust that's going on over there. Anyway, that's just silly stuff. The biblical centerpiece. So I want us to look first at the idea that Israel had a very deep spiritual beginning. Now, you say, yes, God made a promise to Abraham. Well, he did. God made a promise to Isaac. Well, yes, he did. God made a promise to Jacob. Well, he did that too. So that in itself would give you a very deep spiritual set, because it was God's communication to the three prominent patriarchs. Remember, we talked about the patriarchal age. So to the three prominent patriarchs, God said, here is my promise to you. Here's my covenant that I make with you. It's an unconditional covenant that God made. So that itself gives you a deep sense of spirituality for the beginning, because nobody occupied that land to start with to say this is ours. In fact, you know this, that Abraham died without owning anything at all? And yet God says, I'll give you this land. So it wasn't as if they went and occupied. It wasn't as if, I mean, they did later on because God told them what to do, but in the beginning, not so. Here's what we see in Genesis chapter 32, verse 24 and 25. I would like you to find it in your Bibles and mark it. Now, I know that at some point in Sunday school, you were taught these verses. And those of you who are Bible readers, you have come across this many times. And I just want you to connect this with the beginning of Israel. All right? It's a bigger event than we might just notice just simply by reading it and reading it quickly. So we read in Genesis 32:24, and Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. Now, this is really an amazing couple of verses in the Old Testament. Jacob, as you know, had been, I call him a renegade. He was known to be a little bit of a conniver, schemer, a cheat, if you like. He did all of that. But there came a time when all of that caught up to him, and Jacob came to the place where he realized that he needed to have an encounter with God. By the way, for every problem that a man faces, whether it's rebellion, whether it's a sin of any kind, the remedy is God. The remedy is not how many sessions of counseling can he get. The remedy is God. Jacob did not go and see a psychotherapist. He did not go for psychiatric help. He did not go for counseling. He was left alone, and all by himself. There was a man that wrestled with him. Know who that man was, because we read in Hosea chapter 12, verses 4 through 5, "Yea, he had power over the angel and prevailed. He wept and made supplication unto him. He found him in Bethel, and there he spake with us, even the Lord God of hosts, the Lord is his memorial." So we know that he who wrestled that night all by himself out in the wilderness prevailed against the angel of the Lord. Now, I don't know how a man like Jacob would take on the angel of the Lord. You know who the angel of the Lord is in the biblical record in the Old Testament? It's the pre-incarnate Christ. So it wasn't as if he prevailed against him in the sense that he overpowered the pre-incarnate Christ. It was that he did not let go. And that's really what it's all about. I think that very few people have ever recognized what it is to cling to God and hang on to God and say, "I will not let you go." Now, God holds us. We are in the palm of his hands. We are safe and secure because of that. But every one of us needs to have an experience of commitment to God in such a way that we would say, no matter what, I will not let you go until you put a blessing upon my life. So Jacob wrestled. The angel of the Lord, who said, okay, he is not going to let go of me. He's going to keep on talking and he's going to keep on arguing. He's going to keep on pleading for my blessing upon him, that the only way I'll be able to get him to stop doing that so that I can go is to put my thumb into his hip. And there's speculation about some people who are of true Jewish background that they have a sinew problem, and I think that's only speculation. But it's obviously recognized. And so he was a lame man from that day on. You mean when you have an encounter with God, you become lame? Could. I mean, he did, but I'm not saying you will. But he did, and I think that for the rest of his days, as he kind of walked like the old cowboy does, I'm sure that when people say, what's wrong with your hip? Jesus put it out of place. Oh, why did he do that? Because I was stubborn. Because I wrestled with him, and I wouldn't let him go. And I clung, and I was going to keep him captive, and he was not going to be kept captive. So he said, look, I'm going to give you something to remember me by. So I believe that Jacob died remembering with that agonizing hip the encounter he had way back. Now think of this. This land called Israel came by promise, but the spiritual encounter was so rich, it was so dynamic, that for all of his days, until the days of his death, Jacob remembered that the blessing of God came upon him because he met God. This was not just simply a decision that we're going to be in this territory and in this land, not a decision that we're going to occupy this. This was first promised by God, and then the power to move forward on it was then enacted by virtue of this encounter, this prayer encounter that happened out in the wilderness. Now, the second thing that I think about tonight, and that is Israel's rejection of the theocracy. Is anybody here that does not know what a theocracy is? Everybody here knows what it is? Okay, then we don't need to belabor that point. Maybe some folks online might be happy to know that a theocracy is when God rules over a land, when you don't have human government, but you have God directly ruling a country. And so when Israel first became a nation, it was God and the men that were in charge of the territories. All right, so after Jacob's wrestling with God, we know that Jacob had how many children? 13. Okay. All right. It's 13. We mentioned her last. Do you remember her name? Do you remember the daughter's name? He had 12 boys and one girl. Dinah. You got it. Okay. My wife laughed at me when I got home, so she said, somebody's in the kitchen, is there? I said, yeah, Dinah's in there, so I just have to go look. They were, in the beginning, when the promise was coming to fruition, they were given parcels of land from the north to the south. And you remember the story of Dan. He got a parcel of land, but he said, this is not big enough for me. I need more. And so they gave him the parcel of land way at the top, and guess what? In the millennial age, he will still get that. So from Dan down to Gad, all the way to the south. But it was God and the man. It was God and the leader of the country, of the province, if you like, a particular state within Israel. So it was not as if there was a king. They were judges, because God always gives responsibility to man. And these judges were there to open the book, to open the law of God, and to say, this is your parcel of land, or this is fair and this is not, you cheated here, or whatever, and then the judgment would come upon them, or the penalty would come. But the day came when Israel, who was led by God, blessed by God, and just kind of kept in hand and protected, I should use that word as well, by God, said that we no longer want that. We want to be able to be self-governing. Isn't that something? At what point would anybody be smart in saying, I don't want God to control my life anymore? Okay, you would say, well, that would be absolutely dumb. Okay, yes, it would be. It would be worse than that. But that's what this nation did. Early. This is not way down the line. This was early when Samuel was the spokesperson for God, communicating Israel to God, the messages to go to Israel. This was the spokesman. And he came to God and he said, Lord, they have rejected me. They don't want me to come and tell them what you're saying. And God said to them, hey, Samuel, they're not rejecting you. He said, you're not the problem. The problem is my people don't want me. How can this be? So early in their days. And the Lord said unto Samuel, hearken unto the voice of the people in all that they say unto thee. Imagine Samuel would have said to God, what shall I do? Because they're requesting something that I know is not in their best interest. Furthermore, they're requesting something that puts you somewhere on the outside of what Israel should be receiving. And so he said, what shall I do? And God said, just go ahead and do it. You know, there comes a time when God just says, okay, go do your own thing and see how you fare. That's basically at the very beginning, when it shouldn't have been like this, that God said, okay, it's up to you now. You're not happy, and you're not loving this, you're not good with this, so we'll just set you free. He said, they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should what? Not reign over them. So from a very dynamic spiritual encounter by Jacob, where this nation was formed and it became the nation of God, to a very early departure, so much so that they were in choosing Saul, who would be the first king in Israel. God said, they will choose Saul. You need to anoint him. You need to do things properly. You need to make it as good as can be made. But I want you to know they've asked me to take my hands off of them. Have you ever heard somebody say, I don't want God in my life anymore? I've heard it way too many times. I have not any way of knowing whether these people ever had God in their lives, but I do know this, that Israel did have God in their lives. We have that encounter. We have the history of that carries on. And then we have this, that they say, we're not happy with God leading us. Woe to the person that says we are not good with God leading us. This is sad. This is dangerous. But we've got many who are in that state today. Israel's path to discipline is a third thought that we want to mention to you. The discipline that has taken place upon Israel is the major portion of the Bible. So when we say that a third part of the Bible, at least a third, is prophecy, and Israel is so much a part of the prophecy, so much of it deals with God not forgetting his nation, God not closed to his nation, but God putting some pressure upon that nation. So we read our Bibles at home, and I know you do. And sometimes when you read in those Old Testament books, you just kind of want to jump over to the New Testament to get a little bit of breath of fresh air. Because it gets to be rather sad. It gets to be rather, wow, this is rugged stuff. You've all seen the child that when her brother or her sister or his brother or his sister gets punished, they cry instead of the one being punished. Well, there were some people sitting on the sidelines, and us included, we see what God was doing to Israel, and you just kind of cringe and say, this is really harsh discipline. This is hard to read. This is hard to bear. But you look at their path to discipline. First of all, you have the critical division that happened within. The critical division that happened within was that they couldn't get along. And so they divided the land north and south. So you have the northern kingdom and you have the southern kingdom. And they weren't necessarily friendly to each other either. So you've got this horrible division that takes place, and this was something that is completely outside of the plan of God. To have Israel, the nation that he formed through his promises to Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac, now all of a sudden become two separate entities within themselves, is man's doing and not God's doing. So how can they be blessed? How can they have freedom? How can they have joy? How can they have prosperity when they have sunk down so low that they actually have a division amongst themselves? Well, that would preach a lot if we were trying to apply that to the church today. How can a church be blessed if there's division within a church? And I don't ever equate Israel and the church. I don't do that. That's heresy. But I just look at how that could be a problem. If there's division in the church, there is no joy or peace. When there's division in this land, the joy and peace is gone. So what we have here is the divided kingdom. So much of the Old Testament, you have to really think about, okay, who is he talking about now? Is he talking about Judah? That's the south, Jerusalem on down. Or is he talking about Samaria? When he talks about Samaria, so much of the reference to Samaria is the north part of Israel. But there's more to the north part of Israel than Samaria, but there's so much of that. Remember that it came to the place where there was such bad feelings between the two of them that the Jews did not want to walk through Samaria. It was a big deal when Jesus said that he must needs go through Samaria, and they kind of looked at him and says, "What? You're going to go through Samaria? This is not what Jews do." But Jesus had a mission, and he had a purpose in all of this, because his purposes for Israel are great and they're significant. But the kingdom became just severely divided, not only divided by saying, okay, here's the north and south border, but it became divided in the sense that they didn't want anything to do with each other anymore. So it was an emotional thing, it was a territorial thing, it was a governmental thing, it was legal in a sense. So you have the divided kingdom. Then, as you see, the kingdom is divided between the north and the south. You have the long history of rebellion, of disobedience, and punishment. You have good kings that rise up where? North or south? South. Never north. South. So you have a good king comes up, and you have some guilt feelings, and you have some little bit of sorrow, and say, boy, did we ever mess up? Did we ever just really blow it at that point? And then they weep and they cry and they put sackcloth and ashes all over them, and they plead with God, and God says, okay, I will forgive you. One of them is Manasseh. And there are a few others like that. In the days of Nehemiah, you have that. You've got the people weeping and crying, and you've got these kind of bad feelings. But it never fixed anything. They never corrected any of their wrongs. And this is where a lot of Christians are. A lot of Christians are, oh God, I don't like the sour grapes that I'm eating, so please take them away and give me sweet grapes again. And then God does that, but still we change nothing. And this is how it was. I mean, there was not one person that had the power to change things. It would have had to be gatherings between the north and the south officials that would have had said, look, we made a big blunder, we made a big mistake, we need to have our land under one umbrella. And then ultimately they would have said, no, that doesn't even work. We need to have God rule over this land. Well, they weren't wanting to do that. They rejected that. So they weren't going to go back on anything. So if it hurts a little bit, okay, it hurts. I'm going to cry. Then, okay, maybe God will lift his hand from me. And he does, and then back again. From idolatry, going into the trees, to the groves, to worship, to imagery, they had all of this. And it was not pleasing to God. So it was a history of rebellion, years, centuries, mostly fighting against God. You know, this is so much human nature. There's a lot of human aspects to this whole matter of Israel, in the sense that unless they have a Jacob experience, they will have this rebellion experience. You see, a man's heart will reveal what it is eventually. And we see that so clearly in this land. You see, the northern kingdom had only wicked leadership. I'm going to show you a little bit of a snapshot I took. I probably you won't be able to see it real clearly. But these are the kings, the 19 kings of the northern kingdom, from Jeroboam all the way down to Hoshea. And it tells you the amount of years that they served as king, gives you the years when they reigned over North Israel. But what I want you to notice is the line here, the character. Look at king number 1, bad. King 2, bad. King 3, bad. 4, bad. Next, bad. Extra bad. Worst of all, who was that? Ahab. Oh, the really bad dude. Next one after him, bad. Then you have Ahaziah, mostly bad. Then you have Jeroboam, most. What does that mean? Well, every once in a while they'd have a flicker of, maybe I need to pray to God. And so, but nothing changed for them. They continue to be bad. Next one, bad, 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 bad. So, how can you have God bless a nation when their leadership is wicked and bad? He won't. He won't. There's so much wickedness that goes on in the upper echelons of our countries and our leadership in the world, not just in Canada, USA, and Mexico, and further south, worldwide. There's debauchery, there's stealing, there's crooked devices. And if people think that God will bless this world the way it is, if he took the apple of his eye, that little tiny little portion of land that we call Israel, if he took that and said, I'm going to put you on severe discipline, is God going to let the world go on this way? The prophetic story of the Bible is so clear. He does not. But at what point will it change? Is it changing now? That's a good question. Is it changing now? Well, next week, all of a sudden they're going to open the golf courses, and then they'll open some different games and different activities, and then we'll say, oh, well, we're all laughing now again. Then come September, who knows? Anyway, the northern kingdom, as a result of their wickedness and their wicked kings, had become irredeemable as a nation before God. They had become irredeemable as a nation. They had not become irredeemable as a people, but as a nation. So God came to the point where he said, I will not let you have charge of that territory that I gave to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. You have only messed it up, and messed it up big time. And you will not continue to have responsibility there. So in 722 BC, the Assyrians came, and they took Shalmaneser, had invaded Israel and laid siege to Samaria. During that time, he took sick and he died, and then Sargon II came in, and he took the king of northern Israel, and he took captives the leading people in northern Israel, leaving the north parts so crippled that there was absolutely nothing they could do. They couldn't regain. Like you couldn't have somebody rise up and say, I'm going to be your next king, vote for me. Or I'm going to be your prime minister, vote for me. They couldn't have that. God put his finger upon them and said, you're going to be in dire straits. For how long? Does anybody know? No, you got the wrong people there. You got the wrong people there. Not 70 years. You're right about the 70 years, but not the right people. Okay, so for how long is the northern kingdom punished? Okay, they're still being punished. They will be punished. There is no redemption for the northern part of Israel. There's no redemption for them. And before you get excited about that, there's a comeback. Okay, and I'll show you the comeback, but I can't do that tonight. But I just want you to think about that. Oh, pastor said that Israel's finished. No, I didn't say that. I said the north part is on punishment and discipline until the end. Okay, so we will look at that more carefully. So is God's patience wearing thin with Judah? Well, we have Judah. See, the northern kingdom has not recovered. They've been widespread throughout the whole world. Judah followed similar behavior. Now, I want you to see something here that you have read in the Bible, I'm sure, but I don't know if you've gotten the connection like you get it tonight. But we read in Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 8, and this is the weeping prophet. Before he was formed in the belly, God had chosen him to be a prophet to the nation of Judah. And when he started prophesying and telling them what God was saying to Judah, he said, and I saw when for all the causes whereby backsliding Israel committed adultery, I had put her away and given her a bill of divorce, yet her treacherous sister Judah feared not, but went and played the harlot also. So here's Judah. Now, the redeeming quality of Judah was that they had godly kings interspersed with bad kings. So this is where the difference lay. The northern kingdom was sold out to wickedness. The southern kingdom had at least once in a while someone who prayed. I think that's why the West is still surviving. If it was not for the odd individuals voted in who still believes in God, we'd be finished, done. So Judah, there was some hope. However, as the prophet gets the word from God, he said, Judah has watched what Israel did, and they're not even afraid of any consequences. They've observed, and they do likewise. So they too were giving themselves over to discipline. So what happened? Well, first of all, God used the king of Babylon. So if you could imagine this, if today, if Iraq invaded Israel, we would say, horrible, horrible, don't do that. Well, that's what happened in history. Babylon, modern-day Iraq, invaded Israel. So Nebuchadnezzar comes along on his white steed, and he shows himself to be a captain, and no one is able to withstand Nebuchadnezzar because he just keeps on pummeling and overcoming other nations. And he walks into Israel, he walks towards Jerusalem, and he says, okay, you're mine. And he takes a lot of the people in Jerusalem to be in captivity in Babylon. Do you know some names of some people that were taken over to Babylon as captives? Daniel? Yeah, you got them. You know the stories in the book of Daniel. So they were taken. They were teenagers. They were taken to be captives, but also with an eye of possibility, because the kings didn't want to just take the countries and leave them. What we do is we bomb the life out of them, then we go rebuild them. And what the king of Babylon wanted was somebody that could govern Judah under his authority. So possibly these men could be trained to be that. So he kept his eye on them. He had some hot potatoes there, didn't he? With Daniel and his three friends. So in 606, he walks in, he takes the goods out of the temple because there's wealthy, good stuff in there, takes it off to be with him in Babylon. In 444, 445 BC, Judah returned to Jerusalem. All right? Now, Barry said tonight 70 years. Jeremiah had prophesied that they would be held captive for 70 years, and so they were. The figures come together from the time that they were ultimately taken captive to the time they were released. It's not easy reading to get that. But there's 70 years when Daniel began to pray and said, I have read from the prophet that Judah would be held captive for 70 years. Why? They were put in the heart of idolatry. They were put in the heart of wickedness. They were put into a place of evil, so they will learn a lesson. Well, when they came back from the Babylonian captivity, their desire for idolatry was pretty much gone. They said, well, we've had our fill of that. We know that leads to nowhere. So we see Judah comes back. They are able to rebuild their temple. That's a part of the minor prophets. They rebuild the temple, not too happy with it, but they're able to get their sacrifice and their worship together. And so they're doing this for a time. But the years went by when Judah was overtaken by the Romans, when the Roman government came into power, and they said, we don't like you people at all. We don't like your religion. We don't like your bloody sacrifice. We don't like the fact that you're not that obedient. So we're going to destroy your city, including the temple. And remember that Jesus sat down and taught his disciples that this building here, there's not going to be one stone left upon the other because they're going to pillage it. And so Titus, the Roman governor, took whatever goods there were in the temple that he wanted to keep for himself and for the government of Rome, took it all. Today you can go to Jerusalem and there's one wall left, not the temple, but the Wailing Wall. And that wall remains probably as a memorial to Israel that here was the temple. And so from 70 AD, basically, the kings of the north are gone since 722 BC. Now the kings of the south. By the way, the kings of the south ceased before 70 AD. They had only guys like Pilate and different people ruling, governors, but not kings. So their kingdom came to an end as well. This is a part where some guys in their teaching system say that 70 AD finished it for Israel. Well, I can see that from a natural standpoint, and I can see it if they don't read prophecy. I can see it if they don't believe Revelation. I can see it if they don't believe in future things. I can see why they would say that, because 70 AD is a really neat figure to be able to say it's done with, it's finished. Not only so, but in 425, the Sanhedrin, that's the official judging, the lawmaking group within Israel, came to an end, and they said, we have no nation. We don't have the real court system anymore. We don't have any kings. We don't have any priests, really. They said we have no temple, so why would we carry on kind of a makeshift governing group? They said we have no power. There's nothing to it we have, and they disbanded. Well, that's a sad story about Israel. So we see the patience of God over a period of 1,500 years when his children rebelled and disobeyed. How patient are you with your kids? How patient are we with the people of the church? How patient are we with our neighbors? How patient are we with people that are ill-behaved in society? Well, God's patience was there for over 1,500 years as he observed the utter rebellion. We see the punishment upon extreme wickedness from the northern kingdom. We see the passion of God in restoring the southern kingdom because he wanted Israel to carry on. That was his passion. It's the apple of his eye. He didn't want them to be on the demise. He didn't want them to cease to be. And so his passion was, okay, let's discipline you, let's chastise you. And if a 70-year strap isn't long enough, wow, that should cure them. Didn't. And we see the persistence of God as he chastises disobedient Israel for more than 1,900 years until today. Next week, we're going to be looking at Israel present, what's happening in Israel. By that time, I know we'll have some footage for you on the screen because so much has been happening. But I want to take you through the modern-day Israel and just see some significance, real significance. And then I don't think we'll end it next week. We're going to go on to at least 3 sessions on Israel and God's dealing with that land. So we're going to come to a close here, and we're going to go on and have some time in prayer.